Um, I'm preminda. I'm from ESCAP. ESCAP is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Given the nature of this session, we decided to do a little bit of a collaborative presentation between myself and my colleague, Mr. Salu Salu, who's a CIO of Fiji. So I will keep my part of it very brief and sort of overarching, while he will speak more specifically about e-government and in Fiji. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, it's the regional arm of the United Nations, which is based in Bangkok. It has 62 members and associate members. Gives you an idea of the membership of ESCAP, stretching from Turkey to Kiribati, from the Russian Federation all the way down to New Zealand, and of course United States and England and France as well. It was established in 1947, and our headquarters are in Bangkok. We have 5 sub-regional offices and 5 regional institutions. The work of ESCAP is focused on research and analysis and normative work. Main focus areas, overarching focus areas, are economic prosperity, poverty reduction, social progress, and environmental sustainability. ESCAP strives to improve its effectiveness by creating partnerships with civil society and private sector, as well as other UN agencies such as UNDESA, UNPOG, and ITU. We also work with other intergovernmental organizations such as ASEAN, PIFS, and SARC. The division I work for in ESCAP is called the Information and Communications Technology and Disaster Risk Reduction Division. And our work focuses on ICT and development, disaster risk reduction, and space technology applications. That basically covers what ESCAP does, and I would like to now talk a little bit about the Pacific Islands. As you can see, they're very beautiful. With a population of roughly 9.3 million people, stretching over an area of over 30 million square kilometers, the majority of the population live in rural and remote communities. It's sea-locked. That's a very distinct characteristic. It's sea-locked means the countries within the Pacific sub-region are sea-locked and stretched out over a long, wide expanse. The elevation of the islands is an issue in the sense islands, countries such as Kiribati, which is made up of 33 tiny islands scattered across an area of roughly 3.4 million square kilometers. The average height of the islands is 6.5 feet. And this is the case with many other islands with elevations of 1 to 2 kilometers. This leads into the region-wide disasters are of significance. I mean, there's a significant impact on these islands from disasters ranging from climate change related to seismic-related disasters such as floods, droughts, cyclones, earthquakes, windstorms, tidal waves, and landslides. To give you an idea of the impact, some estimates from World Bank states that 207 disaster events affected almost 3.5 million people, costing in excess of $6.5 billion since the 1950s. And out of that, $2.8 billion in the 1990s alone. The small size of the Pacific Island economies means that disasters are felt in a much more intense way. In Samoa, the reported average economic disaster cost was about 46% of annual GDP in years where disasters were an issue. For countries in the Asia-Pacific region, disaster losses that exceed 10% of gross domestic product have serious adverse impacts. Comparatively, disaster losses seldom approach 1% of GDP in industrialized countries. In terms of public services, generally speaking, depending on the type of disaster, demand related to public services goes up. This is from missing persons to transportation, to education, to health, immigration, border, coastal security, disaster response management. And ICT can play a role, for example, emergency warnings using SMSs, immigration, G2G immigration services where bodies of neighboring countries can log and share information of people fleeing from one disaster-affected area with their home government in order for local authorities and caregivers to provide better response. These are the type of public services that are required during before a disaster as well as after a disaster. And also there is a need for more public services and rethinking of public services to address the other the other stages of a disaster, which includes preparedness and mitigation. In terms of e-government in the Pacific, the potential is great and has barely been touched. The rethinking of government models and improving transparency in telecom has a great deal to do with the level of e-government in the Pacific. I won't go into too much detail about that because I'll let my colleague, Mr. Salu talk about that. Just to give you some figures, the relationship between broadband penetration and citizen uptake of e-government services. This is the OECD countries. As you can see, the more broadband there is, the more there is demand for e-government. Just want to talk a little bit quickly about ICT connectivity levels in the Pacific and the challenges faced. While the main islands of Fiji, Guam, New Caledonia, and Papua New Guinea have access to the global backbone for telephony and internet through undersea cables, most other islands do not. They use satellite-based communications, and most cases there isn't anything. Some numbers are, in 2009, mobile services were yet to reach many parts of the Pacific. In Kiribati, only 1% of the population accessed mobile networks. In terms of internet use, only 3.6% of the total population had access. To put it in proportion, out of about 820 million internet users in the Asia-Pacific region in 2009, there were 820 million internet users in the Asia-Pacific region. There was only 93,000 in the Pacific, excluding Australia and New Zealand. There are signs of improvement with reforms in the past 3 years or so. The right-hand diagram shows the undersea cable connections that are existing right now. The proposed, there's some private sector initiatives which are proposing more connections, and that is shown in the left-hand slide. So, and there is some level of planning going on at a regional level. The Pacific leaders adopted their Pacific Plan in 2005, which has a digital strategy, and the strategy really is focused on establishing a roadmap for future action for improving ICT connectivity. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Salu to give you something more specific about Fiji. Thank you.